We have 2 more occasional series this season that we hope that you'll come to. On April 16th, back in the 9th floor room that we usually use, we're going to be sponsoring an event with the probation department on intimate partner violence and its implications for community supervision. We're very excited that we'll also have, like we did with the children of incarcerated parents, event that we did at the beginning of the season, a bibliography to share with you about key research and what kind of findings it has to inform your work. And then on May 21st, we're going to do a whole morning on higher education and its potential related to reentry, featuring both a report that's just been released from the Center for Community Alternatives and one that my predecessor, Debbie Muckamal, co-authored that was just released on the potential for higher education in prisons in California. So we hope that you'll join us for both of those. So it is my distinct pleasure. Oh, the other thing that you are invited to is that we sponsor, as part of our Pinkerton Fellowship Initiative, we sponsor symposia on youth justice. And because we had a snow delay, we're doing both of them in the next 6 weeks. On Monday, we are sponsoring a symposia on youth development, what the research tells us. And then, what's the date for the second one? April 14th will be the second part of that, which is how you apply the theory of youth justice to the actual work that we do. So you can enroll in those through our website too. We hope you will. So without any further delay, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kevin Barnsini, who is the Director of Research for the Prisoner Reentry Institute. Dr. Barnsini has been working with PRI for the last year on a range of projects. And in all of those projects has taken a particular focus on what does community mean and what can we learn by thinking about it perhaps in some new ways. So he was the perfect person to moderate today, and I'm just going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning. So it's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers and panelists today. There's no need for me to go through lengthy introductions because we have the bios. But on my very far left is Todd Clear, who's the Provost at Rutgers University-Newark. Next to him is Geert Dhondt, who's the Assistant Professor at John Jay College's Department of Economics. Then we have Kate Rubin, who's the Managing Director of the Civil Action Practice of Bronx Defenders. And then there's Julio Medina, who's the Executive Director and Founder and CEO of Exodus Transitional Community. Thanks, man. We're also waiting on Councilman Jermaine Williams. He represents the 45th Council District, which is parts of Flatbush, East Flatbush, Flatlands, and so on in Brooklyn. So I was asked to give a kind of framing at the very beginning to orient you to what Todd and Geert's research is. And this is quite challenging for me. One is because I'm speaking to a microphone. 2, I don't have PowerPoint slides that I can hide behind. And 3, I tend to like to walk around the room and wave my arms a lot. I'm being told I have to try and be more professional, so I'll do my best. So today's topic is the consequences for communities of the growth of mass incarceration. I think it's important to spend a little bit of time trying to orientate ourselves to this topic. So often when we think about mass incarceration, we're thinking about the impact and the experience of incarceration on individuals. We talk about collateral consequences that individuals experience and the services and supports that an individual needs as he or she re-enters the community. But what Todd and Geert's research does is it shifts things out another level to a wider level. Instead, what they're asking is what is the impact of this continual cycling from community to prison and back again on communities? So they're asking what is the impact of this coercive mobility on the communities from which people are being taken? They provide a direct challenge to the view that incarceration makes communities safer because it takes people who threaten community safety off the streets. In this coercive mobility thesis, Todd argues that prison removals and returns damage the already weakened social fabrics of communities, which leads to increases in crime. But first, a few words on community. The term community is a very nebulous and shifting concept, and it means different things to different people. We can think of community as a historically and politically defined geography. It's the community of the 45th Council District, or we can talk about Community Board 11. This kind of community is a territorial community, it's a bounded community. We also may talk about territories which has ethnic enclaves within them. You hear people talking about Chinatown or Spanish Harlem. Or we might identify bounded areas where the people within that area largely share a similar socioeconomic status. So we might talk about the Lower East Side or the Upper West Side. But for other people, the term community is they're really talking about a set of relationships and a set of networks that exist between organizations and institutions within that community and across other communities. They're talking about the interrelationships between businesses, between churches, schools, colleges, law enforcement, and of course, families. At times, these affiliations and relationships, they actually transcend fixed geographic boundaries. We talk about the immigrant community, we talk about the gay and lesbian community, or the blogging community. And we often use this word interchangeably with the word neighborhood. And proxy for community is often neighborhood, and neighborhood when we're talking about community. We talk about community engagement through neighborhood opportunity networks. Of course, neighborhoods are smaller territorial spaces. Neighborhoods have been described as the building blocks of community, and they help to reflect social solidarities and patterns of self-help. Some scholars talk about the psychic commitment that exists within neighborhoods, which are fostered by that geographic proximity. But I think it's important to note that we mustn't paint the picture of community as too rosy. As Jock Young would always say, communities exclude during the process of inclusion. By identifying who we are, we're clearly defining who is not part of us, who is an outsider, who is the other. And we certainly need to be careful of falling into the trap of seeing community as the panacea to every social problem. But equally, we need to be careful when we talk about communities as disadvantaged or deprived or toxic communities. For many of the people living in communities, they talk about love, family, friendships, relationships. So what do we know about mass incarceration in communities? We know that incarceration is concentrated in a small number of communities, typically urban neighborhoods. The problem we face, though, is that very few studies have actually managed to isolate the effect of incarceration on those very communities. And those that we do have aren't very strong studies. This is a problem because when we try to do research, what we really want to do is isolate the effect of the impact of incarceration on communities. We want to understand what that continual cycling back and forth from community to prison, to community corrections, back to prison again, and then back to community supervision again, what that coercive mobility does, how it manages to damage local network structures, undermines informal social control. But to research this, we hit a number of big problems, because mass incarceration is entangled with social disadvantage. It's hard to isolate that mass incarceration from the impact of poverty, violence, social inequality. It's hard to capture, therefore, the magnitude of mass incarceration and prison cycling when it's embedded in social disadvantage. But what we do know is that incarceration is concentrated in communities that are already severely disadvantaged, and that those least capable of absorbing the additional adversities brought on by incarceration. And this is why Todd and Geert's research is so important. It's an important step in giving us some nuance. Mass incarceration impacts different communities differently. And when we're armed with this nuance, we can begin to identify strategies and policies that can really help individuals, neighbourhoods and communities. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Todd.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Ann, for asking us to do this. I hope we stimulate some thinking and maybe some ideas about strategies. Let me start by saying how happy I am to be back at John Jay. I was a professor here for more than a decade, and this building hadn't been built yet, and it really is spectacular what's happened to this place in the few years that I've been gone, and I always love coming back. So I'm glad to be back, and I'm glad he asked to do this. I'm going to set the stage for the results of a study that lasted, I think we spent almost 3 years on this work, maybe a little bit more. And Geert will talk about the actual statistical results, partly because he's an economist and understands numbers probably better than I do, but also because he was mainly involved in producing those numbers. The title of the talk is Growth of Incarceration in the United States, Consequences for Communities. There are a host of consequences for communities of the large number of people going in and out of prisons who live there, as Kevin alluded to. And we're only going to talk about one, and that's crime. And crime is particularly important because, at least theoretically, one of the reasons we're locking all these people up and then returning them back with all the processes that go on is that it has something to do with our concern about crime. And so we're going to talk about really one of the main consequences, but I don't want to suggest that that's the most important one for us to think about, and there are lots of other consequences. People are writing books about them now for children, for spouses, for neighborhoods, for economics, and so on. We're just going to talk about crime. And I'll give you the bottom line. We started out with the belief that incarceration matters for communities and crime, and we will talk more about that. And we made an argument in receiving the grant to do this research that incarceration matters in ways that are not intuitive. The answer to the question, what did you learn, is that we learned, yes, we were right, but we also learned that places matter. The characteristics of the places where incarceration occurs also matter, and places aren't all identical. So now you know what the conclusion is. Let me fill in all the blanks to the end. But I don't know if you watched Downton Abbey, but I'm wanting to know what the conclusion is there too. So it's remarkable to me how much the story. By the way, this is the grant that we received to be able to do this work. It's called Predicting Crime Through Incarceration: The Impact of Rates of Prison Cycling on Rates of Crime in Communities. And it's important that you see that title because it gives an illustration of how much the story has changed just in the last few years. So the solicitation that NIJ put out, that we got this grant for, was a solicitation to do predictions of crime rates. And the idea was that people would look at uniform crime reports or demographic changes or whatever, and try to use them to show predictions of crime rates. And when they got this proposal from us, they were shocked. They didn't think that you would want to think of incarceration as giving you some basis for predicting crime rates. The reason why that's important is that they never, even though prison rates had been growing for over 40 years in the United States, there had never been a study of the impact of that on anything funded by the federal government. And the only way you can get grant money to study the growth of incarceration for years, for 3 decades, was to frame your research question even though everybody knew that the biggest story in town was the growing prison population, was to frame your research question inside some other question. So the original research that we did in Tallahassee was a part of a drug solicitation. What are the kinds of policies that affect drug rates in communities? And we wanted to look at incarceration as one of those policies. So today, and I think your president, Jeremy Travis, has been an important part of this, today the entire conversation has changed. Somebody was telling me, it was Andrew Carr, Andrew was telling me, who was it? Bernie Carrick now is against mass incarceration? Of course, you know why. But so are the Koch brothers, right? So the conversation we're in the middle of such enormously shifting sands. And so this study starts out as can we sneak in some research on communities while the other research apparatus is going on? It comes out the other end saying, we have something important to say about something that everybody is currently talking about. Geert put this in there. I think it's self-explanatory. There is a certain quality to which there's an impersonalization of a processing of lots of people through a prison system, and that is really what we're talking about. This is the macro picture, the red or whatever, close to red. Somebody knows a better name for that color probably than I do. The red line is crime rates, the blue line is incarceration rates. I could say an awful lot about this, but I'll say two things because we want to give time for a discussion. One is, you can see that the crime rate precedes the incarceration rate, doesn't follow it, right? There's this huge growth, and it's really decades later that incarceration starts catching up. And you'll see that the crime rate starts falling at about the same time that the incarceration rate starts declining. And so, and the other point I'll make is that you can pull out any 7-year period there and make any argument you want to make about the relationship between incarceration and crime. You want to say incarceration is associated with crime going up. There are several different 7-year periods that make that. Incarceration is associated with crime going down. There are also 7-year periods. And if you want to say there's no relationship, there are 7-year periods there. So whatever argument you want to make about the relationship between incarceration and crime, that graph will enable you to make. So what about predicting crime rates through incarceration? So traditionally, and the common sense view is that if you lock somebody up, you prevent crime. They can't commit crimes. I'm not going to talk a lot about what's wrong with that view because the incapacitation argument that's generally used is simplistic. Just because Joe is in prison and therefore cannot commit crimes doesn't mean the crimes Joe would have been involved in had Joe been out are no longer being committed, right? So there's lots of, and that's particularly true for drug-related crime. You lock up a person for a drug crime, you create a job opening in the community. But there's an alternative view, and this is the one that we explored, that something happens when you have large numbers of people cycling in and out of the prison system in a community to that community. And it's not about deterrence or incapacitation. It's about really what happens. So the traditional views say, these are the factors that affect crime rates. You incapacitate people. People go to prison, they get rehabilitated. We know that those rates are low. Retribution somehow creates a more just society, or the presence of crime rates deters people. So these are the general arguments that are made. But in a paper that I published in the 80s, entitled Backfire, which ironically was published in the Oklahoma Journal of Correctional Research, which had, I think, 2 issues, and then was closed down. But for a long time, when you Googled me, this was the thing that came up because it passed around. It was one of those things, because it was a counterintuitive argument. There are lots of ways in which we can think that prison growth could produce more crime, right? So if people come out of prison, for example, less able to live crime-free lives, and you put a lot of people in that experiment, you're actually producing more people who are more likely to engage in crime. Community level effects that have been explored. So just give you one example. We know that going to prison reduces economic activity of an individual over the lifetime of 40%. So if you have a neighborhood where everybody's been to prison, you have a neighborhood where everybody has 40% less economic activity. And if that's the neighborhood, then the kids who live there, the adults who live there, the businesses that are trying to thrive there, all those things have more trouble being vibrant. And in places where there's no vibrant economic activity, what do you get? You get more crime. Our particular thesis was around coercive mobility. One of the things that we know that is associated with crime rates is neighborhood level instability. And instability is generally measured as the number of people who are moving in and out of that neighborhood. And when you have a lot of people being moved in and out of the neighborhood because they're being sent to prison and then returned, what you have is what we coined as coercive mobility. Dina Rose and I writing back. And the last point I'll make is that it's about stock and flow. So we often think about crime rates in terms of the stock population of people who are incarcerated. So for example, right now, there are almost 6 times more people incarcerated than there were in 1980. So, and if I said to you today, in the next 30 years, we're going to lock up 6 times more people, and I'd say, what do you think? You'd say, well, we can't afford it. But then you'd also say, but there'll be no crime. The truth is, we have the same crime rate we had in 1976 with almost 8 times as many people incarcerated. So if I told you in 72, we're going to increase the number of prisoners by 8-fold, but we're going to get the same crime rate when we're done, you'd have said, bad deal. I want out of that deal. But the flow is also more important. So for example, almost 1 million people go in and out of prison every year. 7 or 8 or 9 million go in and out of jails every year. So it's not just the number of people who are currently incarcerated on any given day, but it's the number of people who are experiencing this process. And at the neighborhood level, that's what produces the instability that we're talking about. So the guiding thesis of this work is that the effect of the stop population of prisoners on reducing crime is overcome by counteracted by the effects of the instability in that neighborhood produced by large rates of people coming back and being removed. Obviously, a large number of people returning from prison produces instability in that neighborhood to absorb people, but also the large number of people being removed also produces instability. Every family loses a family member, the economic activity that person produced is gone, So the hypothesis of our work is, what is the positive effect of, by positive that means making crime rates go up, that doesn't mean good. What is the impact on crime rates of releases? What is the impact of crime rates on crime rates of admissions? And how are those affected by the level of concentrated disadvantage? So in Tallahassee, in our original Tallahassee research, Dina Rose and I found in 2003, found a tipping point. That when neighborhoods reach a certain level of disadvantage, the flow of people in and out, when the flow of people in and out of a prison, this is important, when the flow of people in and out of a prison, of a neighborhood to and from the prison system reached a certain point, crime rates started to increase. So there was a tipping point of the effect on the neighborhoods. And that's important because I think our research adds to that.
The study that we did and I believe it took 5 years.
5 years.
Was to try to estimate the kind of impact of crime, of prison cycling on crime rates in communities. So the first thing we had to do was we had to build a data set, and the first thing we had to do before that was to get the data. That's a whole different story. I have fond memories of driving with Todd to the Camden Police Department and the Trenton Police Department, and well, luckily in Trenton, the only crime you can do is a type 1 crime. They don't keep data on other different things. So there was all kinds of funny stories about many of these police departments have no idea about any crime data and so on. So and not really collected very well. So originally we wanted to go back to 1980. This was quickly reconsidered with the quality of the data that we had. So there was all kinds of challenges with these different things, and so certain cities like Camden we could not use at all. Was going to be impossible to get the data from them. So but the first thing we had to build these data sets. So for most places that we ended up with, Newark, Trenton, rural New Jersey, where we got data from the state police, and Boston, we got data from the police, but we also got data from the correctional facilities for when, so the data set is built on where people live when they enter prison and where people go to when they leave prison. And plus then we can control for all those characteristics of census tracts within the within those particular census tracts based on census data. So what we try to do was just we try to just model that kind of impact. So the first thing I want to show, the great people at like Eric Cadora built a series of maps. So this is a map of 3 places: Boston, Newark, and Trenton. Boston on the left, Newark in the center, and Trenton on the right. And if you look at this map, it might be hard to read, but it is the crime rates per 1,000 residents, and you can see that the red areas are the high places of crime, and the greener areas are less crime. So you can see the variation between them. Here's a map of prison admissions, and if you go look at again at the crime rates and the prison admissions, there is some overlap, but also significant differences, right? So where the crime happens is not necessarily where the prisoners come from. And then this is an index about concentrated disadvantage. So as you can see, there's a lot more just from the map overlap between concentrated disadvantage and prison admissions than prison admissions and crime. So here are some basic correlations between for Boston. So what the number I would like you to look at is the concentrated disadvantage, which is the last line from the bottom up, and you can see the how concentrated disadvantage is related to crime rates, which is a correlation of 0.15, and you can see later on that it's a correlation of 0.4 with with admissions. Right? That's a similar thing, different way to look at it from the same stuff from the maps. Right? That, and if you would look at, this is from Tallahassee data. If you look at the correlations, this is from prison admissions only. You can, and this is the, instead of the concentrated advantage, this is divided with the different kind of components that might be relevant. You can see that prison admissions is highly correlated with percent black, but not with crime. So what that means is, right, neighborhoods which are highly black go to prison, but not, that's not where the crime happens. Or not, the crime in Tallahassee is in black neighborhoods is slightly higher, but the prison, it's about, if I remember correctly, about 1.5 times higher or so in black neighborhoods, but the admission rates are about 9 times higher. So here are some baseline regressions that we have for Boston, Newark, and Trenton, but let me go over to the regressions for Boston, and I don't know if you can read any of these different things. Don't worry, the next one will be even worse. But what we did is the kind of baseline regression for Boston, and we added cycling, and then we have a full for all the neighborhoods. Then we look at the regressions for the neighborhoods to the bottom 99% or the bottom 95%, and then we also have low disadvantage and high disadvantage. So as you can see in Boston, there is significant cycling and a positive effect on crime rates from prison cycling, especially in high disadvantaged neighborhoods. Here are the similar regressions for Tallahassee, and this is probably even harder to see, but as you can see, the sign will switch the sign will switch where in high disadvantaged neighborhoods or high black neighborhoods or high mothers with female-headed households or education, right? Neighborhoods with with lots of people live that don't have a high school diploma, right? In all those areas, there's a very strong correlation between or impact of cycling on crime rates, and this is where in other neighborhoods this is not there's no impact. This is for the high and low disadvantaged neighborhoods for Boston and Newark. So as you can see, for Boston, for example, when there is low disadvantage, there's a negative impact, a negative relationship. But for high, there's a positive relationship. What that means is that, right, where there's not much, in neighborhoods in Boston where there's not much disadvantage, that means that it's not statistically significant, but there's a negative relationship between prison cycling and crime rates. So what that means is that actually, there's no high concentrated advantage. The prison releases and admissions and the prison cycling, right, has a negative impact on crime. That means that if in neighborhoods with no concentrated advantage, people that go to prison, it lowers crime rates, but with high disadvantage, it increases crime rates. For Newark, we do not find this the case, and in Newark, for some reason, unlike Tallahassee or Trenton, we find a negative relationship and not a positive relationship. So for conclusion from this all this work, we find very strong evidence for the coercive mobility thesis, right? Where when incarceration backfires in places like Tallahassee, Boston, and Trenton. So an increase in incarceration leads to an increase in crime in these particular cities. And that is only for places where there's for disadvantaged neighborhoods, but not for other neighborhoods. But in this thesis does not hold in Newark. So we've been trying to figure out why is this the case. So there might be some theoretical reasons and some empirical reasons. So the theoretical reasons is there's a very high degree of concentrated disadvantage, and in Newark. We'll go back to that later in a second. So we also thought, well, if there's a tipping point, right, when at some point when massive amounts of prison cycling will increase crime,